The air was thick with the mingled scents of cinnamon, ginger, and powdered sugar as neighbors bustled in and out of Linda's spacious living room, laden with trays of intricately decorated Christmas cookies. The annual exchange was in full swing, laughter, holiday music, and clinking glasses creating a cozy cacophony. Emma Lancaster stood near the fireplace, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She was dressed impeccably, her emerald green sweater setting off her auburn hair. Beside her, her husband, Paul, was doing his best to appear jovial, but his hand tightened on his wine glass whenever their neighbor's daughter, Katie, entered his peripheral vision. Linda, the host, approached with a fresh tray of cookies. "Emma, you've outdone yourself this year. Your gingerbread cookies are everyone's favorite." Emma smiled graciously, but her eyes darted toward Paul again. He was too quick to laugh at Katie's jokes, too attentive when she spoke. Emma's suspicions had begun weeks ago with a misplaced text message on Paul's phone. It was innocent enough at first glance, a question about a borrowed book, but it was Katie's playful tone and Paul's awkward response that set off alarm bells. Over the following days, Emma noticed other signs. Paul was suddenly meticulous about his appearance. He began taking late-night walks and claiming he needed fresh air. The tension between him and Katie during neighborhood gatherings was palpable, though subtle enough that others might miss it. But Emma didn't. Tonight, Emma had set her plan in motion. She handed Linda a sealed envelope. "Would you mind reading this later during the exchange? It's a little surprise for everyone." Linda, caught up in the festive spirit, agreed without a second thought. As the evening wore on, Emma maneuvered herself closer to Paul and Katie, catching snippets of their conversation. Paul's tone was soft, his posture nervous. Katie blushed, then glanced away when she noticed Emma looking. When it was time for the exchange to officially begin, Linda called everyone's attention. "Before we start, Emma asked me to read something she prepared." She opened the envelope, unfolding the note with a puzzled smile. It seems personal. Are you sure, Emma?" Emma nodded, her face serene. "Go ahead." Linda began reading aloud. "This holiday season, I want to share something close to my heart. My husband, Paul, has found a new love. It's not me, of course, but Katie, our dear neighbor's daughter." The room fell silent. Paul's face turned ashen, and Katie gasped audibly. A few guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure if this was some elaborate joke. But Emma wasn't finished. "Katie, you've been such a help this year, especially during Paul's late-night walks. I hope he thanked you properly." Her voice dripped with icy calm. "And Paul, I hope you appreciate the effort I went to, finding every text, every email, and every charge on our joint credit card from your little dates." Paul stammered, stepping forward. "Emma, this isn't—" "Save it." Her voice cut through his protest. "You've already said enough. Katie's parents are here, and I'm sure they'll be thrilled to know how their daughter spends her free time." Katie fled the room, her face burning. Paul hesitated before rushing after her, only to be intercepted by Katie's father. The men's heated arguments spilled into the hallway, punctuated by Katie's mother sobbing in the corner. Linda stood frozen, holding the now crumpled note, as Emma calmly picked up her wine glass and addressed the stunned guests. "Merry Christmas, everyone. Enjoy the cookies." With that, she turned and walked out into the night, leaving the chaos behind her. The aftermath of Emma's explosive revelation unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck, each piece of the neighborhood's carefully curated holiday cheer dismantling under the weight of her truth. The guests, initially frozen in shock, began whispering in hushed tones. Some tried to distract themselves by nervously nibbling on cookies, while others edged closer to the door, eager to leave the tension behind. Paul stood in the middle of the room, his face a storm of emotions: anger, humiliation, and fear. Katie's father had grabbed him by the collar, shaking him violently. "You absolute disgrace," the man spat, his voice shaking with fury. "How dare you go near my daughter?" Katie, sobbing uncontrollably, pleaded from the corner of the room. "Dad, stop. It's not like that. He said he loved me." Her words only inflamed her father's rage. Linda, the host, attempted to intervene, her voice trembling. Please, let's not do this here. The children upstairs. But Katie's father ignored her, pushing Paul hard against the mantel of the fireplace. A decorative snow globe fell, shattering into 1,000 pieces on the hardwood floor. The noise jolted everyone into motion. Enough! Shouted a voice from the crowd. It was Emma, who had returned, still impossibly composed. She stood in the doorway, her presence commanding. Paul, you have 5 minutes to gather your things and leave the house. Don't bother coming back. Paul glared at her, his voice a low hiss. You think you can humiliate me like this and walk away unscathed? You're making a scene. Emma stepped closer, her tone sharp as broken glass. I didn't make this scene, Paul. You did. Every lie, every excuse, every disgusting little secret you thought I wouldn't notice. This, she gestured around at the chaos, is just the natural consequence of your choices. For a moment, Paul looked as though he might argue, but something in Emma's eyes stopped him. He turned on his heel and stormed toward the door, muttering curses under his breath. The room was silent, save for Katie's muffled crying. Her parents quickly whisked her away, their faces a mixture of anger and shame. The party disbanded shortly after, the guests leaving in small groups, their voices low with gossip and speculation. Linda, overwhelmed and flustered, approached Emma as she collected her coat. Emma, I'm so sorry, Linda stammered. I had no idea. Emma gave her a faint smile. Don't apologize, Linda. You've always been a wonderful host. But next year maybe stick to sugar and spice, not scandal. She left without another word, walking briskly into the cold December night. Snow had begun to fall, softening the world around her. For the first time in weeks, she felt lighter, freer. The weight of Paul's betrayal no longer pressed on her chest. As she walked down the quiet street toward her sister's house, where she planned to stay for the night, Emma allowed herself a rare smile. Christmas was about endings and beginnings, after all. And while this chapter had ended messily, she knew her story wasn't over yet. She'd find peace or maybe even joy on her own terms. The neighborhood, however, would never forget the Christmas cookie exchange that shattered its perfect image. The days following the Christmas cookie exchange turned the neighborhood into a hotbed of speculation and whispers. For years, the small, tight-knit community had prided itself on unity. But now, every conversation held an undercurrent of tension. Emma, meanwhile, kept to herself. She had no intention of basking in the drama she'd ignited, nor did she care to entertain pity from those who reached out to her under the guise of checking in. She had moved into her sister's guest room and was already meeting with a divorce lawyer. Her focus was forward, not back. But the neighborhood had its own way of handling things. Katie became the pariah of the block. Her parents, once the life of every social gathering, now avoided eye contact with neighbors at the grocery store. Katie herself had vanished. Rumors swirled that she'd gone to stay with relatives out of state. Paul, too, became a ghost. Emma knew he'd moved into a small apartment downtown, but she didn't care to know more. The last time she saw him was at the bank, where they both signed off on dividing their joint accounts. He had tried to speak to her, some mix of apology and self-pity, but she'd cut him off with a simple, "It's done, Paul." The neighborhood's dynamic shifted irrevocably. At first, Linda tried to revive the group's spirit, suggesting a New Year's gathering to turn over a new leaf. Few attended. The specter of that night lingered too heavily, a reminder of the fragility of their suburban harmony. One evening, as Emma walked back from a nearby cafe, she was surprised to see Katie's mother, Carol, waiting on her sister's porch. The older woman looked disheveled, her usual polished appearance replaced with weariness. "Carol," Emma greeted, cautious. "What are you doing here?" Carol hesitated, wringing her hands. I needed to talk to you. About Katie." Emma stiffened but nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Once seated, Carol's voice cracked as she spoke. "I didn't know," she said, tears brimming. "I had no idea what was going on between her and Paul. If I had..." She broke off, shaking her head. She's young, foolish, but she's my daughter, and she's broken now. She doesn't eat, doesn't talk. She thinks her life is over." Emma listened, her expression neutral. Part of her wanted to feel pity, but she couldn't summon it. "Carol," she said after a long silence, "your daughter made her choices. So did Paul. I didn't create this mess, they did." "I know," Carol said quickly. "I know. I'm not asking you to forgive her. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what it's worth." Emma leaned back, exhaling slowly. The apology was unexpected, but it didn't ease the sting of betrayal. Still, she recognized the sincerity in Carol's voice. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "I really do. But this isn't something a simple apology can fix." Carol nodded, defeated. She left soon after, leaving Emma to sit alone with her thoughts. As the weeks passed, Emma began piecing her life back together. She found solace in simple routines, long walks, redecorating her sister's guest room, and finally taking that art class she'd always wanted to try. Slowly, the bitterness ebbed, replaced by a cautious optimism. The neighborhood's scandal, however, remained a cautionary tale. By spring, new families began moving into empty homes, filling the void left by those who couldn't face the lingering whispers. But the memory of that Christmas lingered like the faint scent of cinnamon in the air, a reminder that beneath every picture-perfect facade, secrets often simmer, waiting for the slightest spark to ignite. Spring brought change to the neighborhood, but the scars of that fateful Christmas lingered. The once thriving community gatherings now felt forced, with fewer attendees and strained smiles. Emma, however, had no interest in the lingering tension. She was carving out a new life, one that no longer revolved around Paul, the neighborhood, or the image of perfection she'd once clung to. One crisp Saturday morning, she packed her belongings into the back of her car. Her sister hugged her tightly at the curb, both relieved and proud. "You're really doing it," her sister said, brushing back tears. Emma smiled, her face brighter than it had been in months. "It's time. There's nothing for me here anymore. I need a fresh start." The moving truck she'd hired was already en route to a cozy little cottage in a nearby city. It was modest but charming, surrounded by flowering dogwoods and just a short walk from a bustling downtown filled with art galleries, cafes, and new opportunities. As she drove away, Emma felt a sense of closure. She didn't glance back, didn't linger on the past. She was heading toward something better. Back in the neighborhood, Paul's name was now spoken only in whispers. Rumors swirled that he'd lost his job due to personal issues and had moved farther away, though no one knew exactly where. Katie had returned briefly but kept to herself, her once bubbly demeanor replaced with quiet apprehension. Her parents eventually sold their home and left, unable to endure the cold stares and judgment of their neighbors. Linda, still determined to restore the neighborhood's sense of unity, decided to host a summer block party. She sent out cheerful invitations, planned elaborate decorations, and even booked a live band. But the turnout was dismal. The neighbors arrived in small clusters, their interactions polite but distant. "Things just aren't the same," one neighbor remarked quietly to Linda. She nodded, sipping her wine, and let the conversation drift to safer topics. Deep down, she knew the neighborhood would never regain its former charm. The fracture caused by Emma's dramatic reveal had exposed the fragility of their bonds. As for Emma, her new life unfolded like the pages of a novel she hadn't realized she'd been longing to write. Her small cottage became her sanctuary, filled with light and color. She threw herself into her art classes, discovering a talent she'd only ever dabbled with before. Her evenings were spent sketching by the window, listening to the sounds of the city. It wasn't long before she made new friends, people who knew her not as Paul's wife or the woman at the center of the Christmas scandal, but simply as Emma. She joined a local book club, started volunteering at an art gallery, and even accepted a date with a kind-hearted history professor she'd met at a cafe. One evening, as she stood in her little garden, tending to the flowers that were just beginning to bloom, Emma paused to take in the moment. The air was warm, filled with the hum of crickets and the faint laughter of children playing down the street. She had survived betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak. And now she was thriving. The scars remained, they always would. But they no longer defined her. Emma had found her way out of the shadows of her past, stepping boldly into a future that was entirely her own. And for the first time in years, she felt free. By the time summer turned to autumn, Emma's life had taken on a rhythm she cherished. The mornings were hers alone, spent walking along the tree-lined streets near her cottage or sketching at the small wooden desk she'd placed by the bay window. Afternoons brought art gallery shifts or quiet coffee dates with her growing circle of friends. Each moment felt like a quiet rebellion against the chaos she'd left behind. One day, while unpacking the last box that had lingered in her closet, Emma stumbled across an old photo album. Inside were pictures of her life with Paul, smiling faces at holiday parties, trips they'd taken together, moments that once felt perfect but now seemed like remnants of another person's story. She hesitated, her fingers grazing the edge of a photo, then closed the album firmly. "Not anymore," she whispered, tucking it away on a high shelf. Her life now was about moving forward, not looking back. Back in her old neighborhood, the cracks left by Emma's dramatic departure had widened. Linda eventually gave up her crusade to reunite the community. She sold her home and moved to a smaller town where she could start fresh, free from the lingering tension. Paul, meanwhile, had resurfaced once or twice in passing. Seen at a local bar, disheveled and brooding, the weight of his actions had left him isolated. He'd lost not only his marriage but his reputation and social connections. Whatever charm he'd once wielded had soured into bitterness. Katie, too, struggled to rebuild her life. After moving in with an aunt, she enrolled in a college program and kept her head down. The scandal had stripped her of the carefree innocence she once displayed, leaving her quieter, more introspective. She no longer chased attention but focused instead on finding a path of her own. Emma's new chapter truly began the day she decided to submit one of her paintings to a local gallery's juried exhibition. It was a simple piece, a landscape of the view from her garden at dusk, but it carried the weight of her journey. She'd poured her soul into every brushstroke, and when she handed it to the gallery owner, her heart raced. "Beautiful," the owner had said. "This has so much feeling. We'd be honored to display it." The opening night of the exhibit was a surreal experience. Emma stood in the crowd, sipping champagne and listening as strangers admired her work. Some commented on the vibrant colors, others on the sense of quiet resilience it conveyed. For Emma, it was more than validation. It was proof that she had transformed her pain into something meaningful. Toward the end of the evening, the history professor she'd been seeing arrived, a bouquet of wildflowers in hand. He greeted her with a warm smile. "You've come a long way," he said. Emma smiled back, her heart light. "I have." As the evening wore on, Emma found herself standing before her painting again, alone for a moment. She traced the lines of the canvas with her eyes, remembering the nights spent working on it, the doubts she'd pushed through, the courage it took to believe in herself again. This was her life now, a patchwork of small triumphs, steady growth, and a quiet kind of happiness she'd never thought possible. And as she turned away from the painting to rejoin her friends, Emma realized she had something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The crisp air of late autumn filled Emma's little cottage with the comforting aroma of spiced candles and freshly baked bread. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and the golden light streaming through her window painted the walls in a warm glow. She had no plans for the day beyond tending to her garden and working on her latest painting, a dreamy abstract piece inspired by the changing seasons. She was just finishing her tea when her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Linda. Emma blinked at the screen, surprised. She hadn't heard from Linda since leaving the neighborhood. "Hi, Emma. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to reach out because I came across something that I thought you should know. It's about Paul. Emma's stomach tightened involuntarily, though she quickly shook her head. She was past that part of her life. Paul was nothing more than a name in her distant history. Still, curiosity pulled at her, and before she could stop herself, she typed a short response. "What is it?" The reply came swiftly. "He's in trouble." Big trouble. There's a police investigation and your name came up. I thought you'd want to be prepared. Asterisk. Emma stared at the message, her heartbeat quickening. She sat down, gripping her phone tightly. Her name? In what context? She debated leaving it unanswered but finally replied. What kind of trouble? Linda's next message was a link to a local news article. Just read this, she wrote. Emma clicked the link, her hand trembling slightly. The headline hit her like a blow. Local man investigated for fraud scheme. Paul Lancaster accused of embezzling thousands from real estate clients. Her eyes scanned the article rapidly. It detailed how Paul, in his desperation after losing his job, had orchestrated a scheme to siphon money from property deals through fake invoices and hidden accounts. The investigation had been ongoing for months, and now that charges were imminent, authorities were looking into everyone connected to him during the time of the fraud, including Emma. Emma's breath caught. She hadn't spoken to Paul in over a year, but she knew how the legal system worked. As his former spouse, any accounts or property they'd once shared could be scrutinized. Her divorce had been clean and thorough, but had he left anything in her name? Had he used her information without her knowing? Before panic could fully set in, she reached for her phone again and dialed her lawyer. The calm, professional voice on the other end reassured her. Don't worry, Emma, he said after she explained the situation. We'll cooperate with the authorities if they contact you, but based on what you're telling me, you're likely just a procedural inquiry. You've been divorced for over a year, and there's no evidence linking you to his activities. Emma exhaled shakily. Thank you. I thought I was done with him. Her lawyer's voice softened. You are. This is his mess, not yours. Let me handle it. For the next few weeks, Emma tried to put the news behind her, but it lingered in the back of her mind like an unwelcome guest. She went about her routine, immersing herself in her art and the small joys of her new life. But there were moments when the anxiety crept in. What if this wasn't the end of Paul's ability to disrupt her life? What if he tried to drag her down with him? Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Paul. Emma stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was familiar but sloppier, rushed. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a scrawled message. Asterisk Emma, I know you must hate me, but I need your help. They're coming after me, and I'm running out of options. You know I'm not the monster they're making me out to be. Please just hear me out. I'll explain everything if you agree to meet me. I'll be at the coffee shop on 3rd Street next Friday at 3 p.m. Paul asterisk. Emma crumpled the letter in her hand, her heart pounding. She didn't owe Paul anything. Not her time, not her sympathy. But the mention of her name in the investigation lingered like a dark cloud. If there was something she needed to know, something that could protect her from being implicated in his mess, she couldn't ignore it entirely. Next Friday, at exactly 2:55 p.m., Emma walked into the coffee shop on 3rd Street. Emma's heels clicked softly against the tile floor as she stepped into the cafe on 3rd Street. The warm aroma of coffee and pastries enveloped her, but it did little to calm her nerves. She scanned the room and spotted Paul almost immediately. He was seated in the far corner, his once pristine appearance now disheveled. His suit jacket hung awkwardly off his frame, and dark circles underlined his eyes. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mix of desperation and guilt. Emma hesitated for a fraction of a second before sitting across from him. She crossed her arms, keeping her face neutral. You have 10 minutes, she said coldly. Paul fidgeted, running a hand through his unkempt hair. Thank you for coming, he began. I didn't know who else to turn to. Emma's jaw tightened. You didn't turn to me, Paul. You dragged me into your mess. My name came up in an investigation because of you. So, tell me what you want and get to the point. He winced at her sharp tone but nodded. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said, his voice low. After the divorce, things got bad. I was broke, angry, and desperate. I made some bad decisions. Okay? But it's not as bad as they're making it sound. I didn't steal thousands, I borrowed. I was going to pay it back. I ran out of time. Emma's expression didn't soften. That's not my problem, Paul. What does any of this have to do with me? Paul leaned forward, lowering his voice. The accounts they're looking at, they might have traces of your name. From before. When we were married, He hesitated, his eyes darting away. I used your information for some of the early transactions. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. Her mind raced, pieces falling into place. The late-night work Paul used to do on his laptop. The sudden influx of funds he'd explained away as bonuses. Even the strange bank statements she'd dismissed as errors. You forged my name, she asked, her voice trembling with anger. I didn't forge anything, Paul said quickly, his hands raised defensively. I used joint account details. And maybe I listed you as a cosigner once or twice. But that was years ago, before we even split. I didn't think it would come back to haunt you. Emma leaned back in her chair, her stomach churning. Unbelievable, she muttered. You're telling me that because of your lies, I could be dragged into your fraud case? Paul reached across the table, his voice pleading. That's why I wanted to talk to you. If they come to you, just tell them you didn't know anything. That you had no involvement. They'll believe you. Emma glared at him, incredulous. You think this is about me clearing my name? You put me in this position. Again. You betrayed me again. Why should I do anything to help you? Paul slumped back in his chair, his confidence unraveling. Because I loved you, Emma. I know I messed up, but we had something real. Doesn't that count for anything? Emma laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. It counts for a lot, Paul. Counts for the years I wasted trusting you. It counts for the pain of finding out who you really are. And now it counts for the fact that I will do whatever it takes to make sure you don't drag me down with you. Paul's face crumbled, but Emma stood, gathering her coat. We're done here, she said firmly. If the authorities contact me, I'll tell them the truth. All of it. You're on your own. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out, her steps steady despite the storm raging inside her. The following weeks were a blur of meetings with her lawyer and tense emails with investigators. Emma provided every piece of documentation proving her innocence, from divorce papers to bank statements. Her lawyer was thorough, ensuring that her name was cleared of any suspicion. Paul, on the other hand, wasn't so fortunate. The investigation revealed the full extent of his fraud. Hidden accounts, falsified records, and a trail of deceit that spanned years. When the trial began, Emma refused to attend, despite multiple summonses from Paul's defense team to testify on his behalf. By winter, the verdict was in. Paul was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Emma read about it in the papers, her emotions a complicated mix of relief and lingering anger. She thought of him only briefly before folding the paper and setting it aside. On Christmas Eve, Emma sat by the fireplace in her little cottage, sipping hot cocoa and admiring the tree she'd decorated herself. She thought back to the chaos of the previous year, the broken trust, the public spectacle. Now, everything felt quieter, simpler, and, for the first time in a long time, peaceful. Paul was finally gone, not just from her life but from her mind. Emma's story wasn't tied to him anymore. She had untangled herself from the past and emerged stronger. Her heart opened to new possibilities and her spirit unburdened. As snow began to fall outside, Emma smiled to herself. This Christmas was hers alone. A celebration of survival, freedom, and the life she had built from the ashes. Winter's chill enveloped the little cottage as Emma leaned against the windowsill, watching the snowflakes drift lazily to the ground. The warm glow of the fireplace behind her filled the room with a golden hue, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The stillness was profound, yet it felt alive with possibilities. For the first time in years, Emma could breathe freely, unshackled from the weight of her past. The events of the last year had tested her in ways she never imagined. Betrayal, public humiliation, and the lingering echoes of Paul's deceit had nearly broken her. But as the seasons changed, so had she. Emma no longer felt like the woman who had once stood in a crowded living room, exposing the lies of the man she thought she knew. That woman was gone, her vulnerability forged into strength and her heartbreak transformed into wisdom. Her phone buzzed softly on the table. It was a message from the history professor she'd been seeing. Asterisk dinner tomorrow night? My treat. I've got a surprise for you, asterisk. She smiled, replying with a simple yes, before setting the phone down. He was kind, patient, and steady, but she wasn't rushing things. For now, she was content with the small joys they shared, a stark contrast to the tumultuous life she'd left behind. Emma walked to her bookshelf, where her latest painting leaned against the wall, waiting for its final touches. It was abstract, a swirling blend of colors that reflected her journey. Vivid reds for pain, soft blues for healing, and streaks of gold that represented the hope she now embraced. She picked up her brush and added a few deliberate strokes, perfecting the image. This piece would be hers to keep, a reminder of where she'd been and where she was going. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a pristine white layer. Emma opened the front door, stepping onto her porch. The crisp air kissed her cheeks as she looked out over her little garden, now asleep under the snow but waiting patiently for spring's renewal. As the bells from a nearby church chimed midnight, signaling the start of Christmas Day, Emma felt a profound sense of closure. The wounds of the past had finally scarred over, no longer aching but serving as a reminder of how far she'd come. She was no longer the woman tethered to someone else's mistakes or defined by their betrayal. Emma had become her own person, rooted in strength and purpose, her life a blank canvas waiting to be painted with new experiences and possibilities. With a deep breath, she whispered into the still night, "Merry Christmas." The snow seemed to glow brighter in response, as though the universe itself acknowledged the quiet triumph of a woman who had reclaimed her life. Emma stepped back inside, closed the door behind her, and walked toward the warmth of the fire, ready for whatever came next.